Our presenter today is a native of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and has earned his Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point. He's recently completed a University of North Dakota postgraduate study program in Geographic Information Science. Over the course of John's career, he's worked as a dairy herdsman in southeastern Wisconsin, an integrated pest management field scout for the University of Wisconsin Cooperative Extension, a mapping soil scientist in east central Illinois. In North Dakota, John has worked as a mapping soil scientist in the east central part of that state, as a soil conservation in Sheridan and Burleigh counties, and as a district conservation in Griggs, Steele, and Dunn counties. He's been the area agronomist for western North Dakota and currently is the area resource soil scientist in that area. He's been actively involved as an advisor and webmaster for the Manitoba, North Dakota Zero Tillage Farmers Association, the North Dakota chapter of the Soil and Water Conservation Society, and recently completed a project called the Southwest North Dakota Soil Health Demonstration. He's been actively learning and teaching about soil health since 1992, and of course, he grows his garden without any tillage. And so I'd like to turn this presentation over to you, John, and let's all enjoy this afternoon's presentation. John?
It's my pleasure to be here today to cover what I know about cover crops. Cover crops have been around for a long time, but more recently we've been using them for some new purposes and for some new approaches to improving soil health. So that's what I'd like to share with you today. In my presentation, first I'd like to cover a little background information on soil health, then get into the thought process of developing your own cover crop mixes, and then a little bit of case study information at the end. So with that, we'll get rolling here. I realized when I started putting this information together that there was no way I was going to be able to tell everybody exactly what they should do for every situation in every part of the country. What I wanted to share with you today was what I have learned mostly from producers on cover crops and how cover crops are used these days. This practice has been around for quite a while, but more recently we've been looking at how we use cover crops for improving soil health and a lot of other purposes. So that's pretty much what I would like to discuss today. I'd like to start out with some background information on soil health, then get into some discussion on developing cover crops, and then a few cover crop case studies. And when I started putting this information together, I realized that I can't give everyone an answer of what cover crop they should grow for what purpose in their part of the world. So I'm really not going to give you a lot of answers, but help you realize what questions you're going to need to ask yourself as you go through your thought process of deciding if and when and how and what you're going to use for a cover crop. This image here is just an example of a cover crop that was broadcast in the standing corn. But the first thing I think everyone needs to ask themselves is, what is your goal? Don't make the use of a cover crop your goal. Have a goal in mind of improving soil health and having some other purposes with the use of a cover crop. Don't grow a cover crop just because that's the in thing to do right now. Really think this through and decide, what is your goal? What do you want that cover crop to accomplish? And what we're realizing is that cover crops, particularly these mixtures of species, can be an excellent tool to help restore and improve soil health and soil function, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. So restoring and building soil health is a very worthy goal that you can use a cover crop as a tool to help you get down that road. As I was digging in some other information, I'm kind of a student of Thomas Jefferson, and came across some information in his garden book that he kept, and the fact that he used turnip, buckwheat, and vetch as cover crops at Monticello back in 1794, and how he realized that it was important for him to have some crops, some cover crops that would build the soil to alternate with his cash crops. So a little bit about soil health. Soil health is the continued capacity of the soil to function, and I have the words function and living highlighted there because that's really what we're talking about when we refer to soil health, is how well is your soil functioning. And we have to understand that it's a living system. It's a biological system. And once we change our thinking to realize that the soil is a biological system, it's a living system, then our approach to soil management changes, and we begin to realize that what we're doing here is creating habitat for these things that live in the soil and drive all of the processes that we expect the soil to perform as an agricultural system. So when we look at cover crops from a soil health perspective, they're really functioning as a primer of soil biology. They're providing this food source and this diversity that the soil food web really thrives on. So we're finding that if we put these multi-species cover crops out in our systems, that they're really priming the soil and bringing it to a higher level of function. So we need to think about feeding the underground herd, as it's been referred to. And if we could round up all of these microorganisms in the soil and run them across a scale like we could cattle, we would have at least 2 cows worth. It's probably closer to 5 cows worth, but at least 2 cows worth of soil organisms per acre. So if you can imagine 2 cows standing out on every acre of your land needing to be fed, that's really what we need to understand as we manage our cropping systems and grow these cover crops. So the soil food web, and this diagram I borrowed from the soil health primer, or soil biology primer. And I like this diagram because it really emphasizes what we need to understand and what we need to think about when we're managing these systems. So this system of the soil as a biological system is supposed to be powered by the sun. And that sun, through photosynthesis of green growing plants, provides the sugars that are exuded out of these plant roots, the residues from these plants that feed all of the smallest members of the soil food web, bacteria and fungi in particular. Then as these organisms are consumed by larger organisms as we move through the food web, that's where more nutrients are made available to the plants. Whenever someone gets eaten in the soil food web, that excess nitrogen, as those carbon-nitrogen ratios change, that excess nitrogen is fed back to the plants. So the plants are able to feed the soil using the sun as a source of energy, and then the organisms in the soil are able then to feed the plants. And we have these cycles that are powered by the sun. this is how the soil is designed to function. So if we do our best in our management systems to mimic nature and manage the soil the way it was designed to function, we're finding that our systems are much more productive and efficient and profitable. So this is our toolbox. Green growing plants are the tools in our toolbox. We need to think about when we want to manage the soil, we need to think about managing that soil with plants. So we should be reaching for seeds rather than steel to do tillage. We should be reaching for seeds to grow the plant or plants in that soil that will address whatever it is we need to manage that soil. So when we get right down to it, all of the things that happen in the soil that we rely on from an agricultural perspective, we expect the soil to infiltrate and store water and supply nutrients to the plants. And really what it's all about is this habitat. And in the world of soil organisms, soil aggregates are their habitat. And you can see in this little image down the lower right an aggregate forming, the sand grains, the silt, the clay, other things being glued together by the glue that's produced by bacteria, fungi, plant roots, earthworms, etc., that glue these aggregates together. And it's important to understand that we can't create aggregates with tillage. We can only break these aggregates down with tillage. It's these glue makers, these organisms that live in the soil and plants, that can build these soil aggregates and create this habitat and this structure in the soil that allow it to perform the functions we expect it to perform and to provide the habitat for the organisms so they can do the nutrient cycling. An easy way that we use to assess soil health is just to look at aggregate stability. Look at how good are these glues holding the soil aggregates together. So if you take a piece of soil off the surface of your land, or the top few inches of your land, those natural aggregates, those clumps and clods that it breaks into, let them dry out so they're air dry, and then drop them into some water, you'll get a very good measure or indication of how well is my soil functioning, how good is the glue holding the aggregates together, and how well is this habitat stabilized in the soil. When that water rushes into the aggregate and pushes the air out, if the glues are of high quality, that aggregate will hold together, as in the image on the left. If that air rushes out as the water rushes in and the aggregate explodes and disintegrates in the water, then that's an indication that your soil habitat is not very stable. The quality of your organic glues is not very good holding that soil together. When it rains, the soil gets wet at the surface. If those aggregates disintegrate when they get wet at the surface, they plug the system, and the water has a very difficult time infiltrating the soil. And you see a lot of water run off the field. So we really don't have a water runoff problem. We have a soil water infiltration problem, and that can only be solved by feeding soil biology so they can make these glues that will stabilize our soil aggregates. Where a lot of this takes place is in this area right around the roots of living plants, which is called the rhizosphere. And this area of concentrated activity is where all these glues are made, where all the nutrients are cycled, etc. which is very convenient to the plant because the nutrients are then made available right next to the root where the plants can absorb them. So in this image here, I just took a barley plant, an actively growing barley plant that I dug up, shook the soil off, but a lot of soil was still clinging to the roots of this plant because there's sugars being exuded by these plants. All these organisms are living right in this area where all this easy food is being made available. And so we have a lot of sugar, a lot of glues, a lot of activity right there causing the soil to cling to these roots when we dig these plants up. But it's a nice visual of how all of this is happening in this rhizosphere right next to the plant root. So the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, for managing for soil biology and soil health, there's really 4 key things that I look at and explain to folks when they're thinking about how can I manage my soil to improve soil health. And those 4 things are to minimize soil disturbance as much as possible. There's some situations where there's going to be a certain amount of soil disturbance, but look for the ways that you can minimize the disturbance of the soil. A lot of producers in my part of the world here have gone to no-till so that they have the absolute minimum amount of disturbance to the soil every year. Maximize diversity of plants in your rotation, and this is huge. And this is where cover crops are coming in and having a very significant impact, is we need to get as many different types and species of plants growing in that soil as possible, because we have a huge diversity of organisms that live in the soil that need to be fed. And keeping living roots in the soil as much as possible provides those organisms with their easiest food source. Those sugars that are exuded from those plant roots is the easiest food source for them to assimilate and grow. So cover crops come into play there, where we have living roots out in that soil for an extended period of time beyond or in addition to what we normally have with our cash crops. The 4th thing is to keep the soil covered with plants and plant residues all of the time so that we buffer this soil habitat so it's not exposed to extremes in temperature and moisture. And we provide the food source for part of the soil food web that lives at the soil surface, that lives in that residue, that starts to shred that residue apart and get it fed into the soil system. So if we were going to boil this down to one point, it would be to create the most favorable habitat possible for the soil food web. I got a kick out of this little diagram that I came across of the 2 rabbits and their carrots, because when we're talking about cover crops, it's the part below ground. For me, it's the part below ground that is the most significant, because that's what's feeding the soil food web. Yes, we need to have the top part of the plant to cover the soil. That's important. But we tend to look at the part of the plant and the production at the surface rather than looking at the impact that the plant is having on the soil. Okay, so that's kind of the short course on soil health. Before we actually get into the cover crops part, were there any questions?
We're not seeing any questions right now. So
okay.
Carry on. For the group, please type your questions into that notes transcript box. Thanks.
Okay, now to get into a little bit more of the cover crops thought process, the first question in my mind would be, why should I even bother growing a cover crop? Or what am I going to grow this cover crop for. And the first one, in my mind, is to feed the soil food web so that I can build the capacity of my soil to function, to perform the functions I expect it to perform when I want to grow my cash crops. Another purpose might be to provide some supplemental forage for livestock, provide soil cover at a point in the rotation or at a time in our cropping system when we might not have a lot of soil cover, provide wildlife food or cover, capture and cycle crop nutrients. And this one can be very important in places where you may have an excess of rainfall at certain times of the year. And the best way to keep those nutrients from escaping through runoff water or groundwater is to get them tied up into some plant tissue so that they're held there until that plant tissue decomposes and then becomes available to the next crop. We can use the cover crop to fix some nitrogen, some atmospheric nitrogen, by including some legumes in our cover crop. In this part of the world, it's important for us to catch some snow in the wintertime. That's a significant part of our annual precipitation. So if we can catch that snow, that adds to our water supply in dryland agriculture. Depending on what species you have in your cover crop and what degree they mature, we may be able to support some pollinators with our cover crops. And we can create pores through the soil, through compacted layers in the soil. We can create pores with these cover crop root systems. So this is just a short list of all the things that I'm sure folks could think of that they might want to have as a reason to grow a cover crop. So how do cover crops improve soil health? And cover crops, as we think back to that diagram, you have the green plant, photosynthesis, feeding the soil food web. So the longer we can have something green and growing out there, the more we're supplying that easy food to the soil food web. And if we have a diversity of plants in our cover crop mix, we feed that whole diverse food web of organisms in the soil that much better. From my observation, if we have living roots of a cover crop in the soil for at least a 6-week period, we're seeing significant nutrient cycling to the extent that the nutrient cycling, the nutrients that are applied or supplied to the next crop, are usually equal to the money that we've spent on a cover crop. So don't necessarily look at a cover crop from the biomass that it produces above, but think about how many weeks has that plant been green and growing and feeding the soil, and not measure so much how much production is above ground. We also want to produce that residue, that biomass that will cover the soil, because that's an important part of buffering that soil and feeding the soil food web. So cover crops can really play a big role in feeding the soil, improving soil health, if we have the diversity of species in there and we can get at least 6 weeks or so of growth out of them. So some of the questions we need to ask ourselves as we plan for our purpose is, when and how are you going to plant this cover crop? Is it going to be planted with a drill or a planter or broadcast or flown on with an aircraft? What species are you going to include? How many different species and which ones? How are we going to terminate this cover crop? Here, winter terminates our cover crops pretty handily for us, but you may look at other methods and timing of when you would want to terminate a cover crop by rolling it or grazing it or spraying it. And then how much cover is this cover crop going to leave on the soil, and when is that residue going to be present? Is it going to cover the soil during the time that we need it to cover the soil? Okay, planting, the timing, if we're going to look at planting our cover crop before we harvest or after we harvest our cash crop, and what time of the year would that be? What is our moisture conditions? Are we going to be able to drill that or use a planter or broadcast that seed? Think about the planting depth and the seed size. Most seeds don't really need to be planted any deeper than twice their diameter, but when we're planting these cover crop mixtures, we have large seeds like peas or beans and small seeds like canola and radish, turnip. We found that if we plant things about 1 inch deep, it's kind of a Goldilocks zone where everything can grow from there. We can mix a lot of these seeds prior to planting. They can be purchased all mixed together and dumped in the drill or planter mixed together, or we can put them into a drill and mix them once they're in the seed box if we're only doing a small amount at a time. If legumes are going to be included in your cover crop mix, you need to be aware of which inoculant you need for each particular legume, whether it's rhizobium or bradyrhizobium or whatever the case might be, so that you make sure that you get the right bacteria growing with that legume and get those benefits of fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere. You may want to do a pre-plant herbicide burn down before you plant your cover crop, depending on what your time of year is or your weed pressure. That's not always necessary, but in some cases producers are going to want to do that to make sure their cover crop is the crop that gets the advantage rather than some weeds that might be coming. And then to decide whether or not you're going to include any fertilizer when you plant that cover crop. In most cases, fertilizer isn't necessary, but there may be reasons that you would want to put some fertilizer out there for the cover crop to take up and hold for you, or if you're in a very degraded situation, you might need something like that to help your cover crop get started. When we're looking at species composition, what we found so far and what we've realized from looking at some of the literature is the more species the better, is the short answer. But we've found that if we have at least 5 species in a mix, we seem to have less weed pressure, fewer weeds showing up in our cover crops, and those cover crops seem to produce more, grow better overall, the greater diversity of species that we have in there. We also like to see at least 3 functional groups. So we think about warm season grasses, cool season grasses, cool season broadleaf, warm season broadleaves, and legumes as basic functional groups. And we'll get into that here a little bit more. The season of growth, if you're planting a cover crop and it's going to do the majority of its growing during the hottest part of the year, then you may want to lean more towards warm season species, or make sure you have warm season species in your mix so that they will grow during that warm period of the year. What your moisture conditions are going to be, grow some things that can tolerate maybe a little bit drier conditions if it's in the summertime, or wetter conditions if it's in the spring. Temperature, there's some species that cannot tolerate much frost that will die when you get a light frost. And there's other things like turnips that it needs to get pretty cold, down to 10 or 12 degrees before it'll actually kill them. so we can manage how our cover crop is going to perform by thinking about what are all these conditions going to be like during the time this cover crop is going to be growing. And we can decide if we're going to use some annuals or biennials or perennials in our mix depending on what our goal might be and how long we want all these things to grow out there. Cost and availability is also an issue. The availability of a lot of these things is becoming a lot easier. They're a lot easier to find than they used to be. But we do like to keep the cost down so that we can achieve our goal without spending any more money than we really have to. We need to pay a little bit of attention to the carbon-nitrogen ratios of the mixtures that we'll have out there and at what stages they will be terminated so that we can figure how much and how fast these things are going to decompose or how fast they might decompose the existing residue that's already out there. And the last thing that we've kind of found out the hard way was herbicide carryover, paying attention to what herbicides have been used on that field, and if there's going to be a carryover that might take out broadleaf species that we might have in our cover crop mix. So pay attention to that so that whatever we plant out there will grow. Just a couple little graphs here that from some work by Dr. Tillman on species diversity. And what they found, if you look at the graph in the upper left there, when we look at species diversity, when you have at least 5 to 10 species in a plant community or in a cover crop mixture, that's kind of the peak of the curve of biomass production. So we kind of found that out with our own observations, and then we found this research that supports it, but that's where these numbers come from. We're trying to hit that sweet spot in the curve there to get the most production out of these things, and that's why we suggest using at least 5 or more species. And if you look at the graph in the lower left, there you can see that the curve starts to flatten out when we have 3 functional groups: the cool and warm season plants, the grass, the broadleaf type plants, legumes are some of the basic functional groups. And we'll get into that a little bit more detail at the end here when we get into the cover crop calculator. So when it comes time to terminate these cover crops, like I said, here in North Dakota, we can usually rely on winter to do that job for us, except for a few winter hardy species. It may be dry enough that it will terminate the cover crop. I know in some of the irrigated country in Idaho, they can just quit watering it and it'll dry up enough that the cover crop will be terminated by drying up. We can graze these cover crops to terminate it. The caution there is to not allow the livestock to consume all of the cover crop so that we don't have cover on the soil, that we're not feeding the soil food web. So we need to be aware of that, and ideally only let those grazing animals take less than half of what's produced and leave the other half or 60% or so on the soil to feed and cover the herd that lives below the soil. There's some nice rollers that have been developed recently with the chevron pattern. I've seen folks use old cultipackers and things like that as rollers to roll some of these cover crops down just as they're flowering or just before they flower, and a lot of times that will kill most of them just by rolling them and breaking the stems. We can also use herbicides to terminate these cover crops when necessary, whether we're concerned about moisture use or just timing of our next crop or crop insurance issues, we can go out and terminate those cover crops that way. Or just let them grow to maturity if they're mostly annuals, and they'll senesce and die on their own. So the other portion that we need to look at is how much cover are we going to have on the soil when this cover crop is growing. How much growth are we going to get before it gets too dry or too cold, etc. How much cover are we going to have after that cover crop is terminated, and how much of that residue is going to survive over the winter or over some fallow period, and how is that going to feed the soil food web. And like I mentioned, we need to be careful of having enough residue after grazing that we don't leave bare soil. Just a little bit more about the carbon-nitrogen ratios. The higher the carbon-nitrogen ratio, the slower the rate of decomposition. The lower the carbon-nitrogen ratio, the faster the rate of decomposition. And you can see that the carbon-nitrogen ratio for a particular species like rye will depend on how mature it is. So rye straw, mature rye, has a much higher carbon-nitrogen ratio than rye when it's still in the vegetative state. So you need to think about how mature are these species of plants going to get when they're going to be terminated, and that will determine your carbon-nitrogen ratio. If that carbon-nitrogen ratio is at or below 30 or so, odds are most of it is going to decompose fairly rapidly, and you may not have a lot of soil cover. So the high carbon cover crops can cover the soil, increase organic matter, capture recycled nutrients, and moderate soil temperatures. Our lower carbon cover crops, such as legumes or some of the brassicas or the grasses in their early stages of development, can fix some nitrogen, are very efficient at using nutrients, and will help us break down high carbon old crop residues if that's part of our goal. We can throw these into a combination and get lots of different benefits, building that soil structure, increasing aggregate stability, but most importantly, increasing biodiversity out there, which reduces our weed, insect, and disease pressures and really helps feed that soil food web. So we need to plan for that diversity and look at including species in our cover crop that aren't already in our crop rotation. So if we already have a crop rotation with a lot of cool season grasses in it, it's probably a good idea to include warm season grasses, cool season broadleaf, and warm season broadleaves in our cover crop, so we have a greater diversity of species that aren't already represented in our crop rotation. So the more species, the better as far as the soil food web, as far as diversity and production. If you look at the image in the center at the bottom, it shows a cover crop in Montana after a frost, where you can see some of the species have died from the frost while some of the species continue to grow. Okay, what about water? This is a question that I get from time to time, that our cover crop is going to use up our water, particularly in dryland systems, and we aren't going to have enough water to grow our cash crop. Here in North Dakota, western North Dakota, some studies that have been done have shown that we have about an 80% chance of success as far as water is concerned if we grow a cover crop that's going to use water late into the season and then expect to have enough moisture the following growing season. You're going to have to evaluate that for yourself in each part of the world, but generally speaking, these cover crops aren't using any more water than we were letting evaporate from bare or unprotected soil in the past. So it's about a horse apiece. And when we look at how these plants behave when we have them in mixtures, some interesting research on a topic called the stress gradient hypothesis, which I referred to in the other two graphs showing the 5 different species and the 3 functional groups. As you grow plants in collections of different species, they collaborate more than they compete. The slides or the images on the bottom there show a turnip cover crop and a radish cover crop that were grown in some cover crop demonstrations here a few years back in Bismarck. We had a very dry summer, and where we had the single species of turnip by themselves or radish by themselves, they pretty much died. They ran out of moisture and died. But where we threw all the species together in a mix, even though we only had less than 2 inches of growing season precipitation, they flourished and grew. So when we looked at, clipped and weighed what was produced there, we could see by the pounds per acre that where we had these species all mixed together, we had a great deal more production, and those plants were alive and green and growing and feeding the soil food web a lot longer period of time during the year than when we had each individual species alone in a monoculture. So when you're developing your cover crop mixes, ask yourself what's the purpose or purposes. There may be more than one purpose that you want your cover crop to serve. Include crop types and species that are not already in your crop rotation. Have a minimum of 5 species of plants and at least 3 functional groups. And in our part of the world, we found that if we have at least 20 pounds per acre of seed, we usually get a pretty good stand without a lot of weeds. More than 20 pounds per acre is fine, but once we got up to 40 or 50 pounds per acre, we realized that we're probably spending money on seed and not seeing as much return. And so it was just more of an economic reason for not going beyond 40 pounds. But at least 20 pounds and 5 species seems to work pretty well, at least here and most of what I've dealt with in the Great Plains here. Look at your time and method of planting and your time and method of termination. If you can answer these basic questions, you'll be well on your way to a good cover crop experiment. Now this table is in the handouts, and I don't expect you to be able to read this, but I just took a little snapshot of a table that we use here in North Dakota to help us look at these different cover crop species and their characteristics as far as their rooting depth, whether they could provide supplemental grazing, things like that, while we're developing these mixtures. Another tool that I want to show you here at the end is available at greencoverseed.com. You can see the web address at the bottom of the slide here. And not promoting Green Cover Seed as a supplier, but they have a really nice little calculator that you can play with to look at how you want to develop your cover crop mixtures. And I want to jump to that here at the end so you can take a look at it in a live version. So just a few, I don't know if we want to take any questions right now, and I have just a couple things on some case studies.
We have a question on planting. There's a technique, slurry seeding with manure. Have you had any observations on that practice or experience with that, John?
I don't have any experience with it. I haven't seen it done, but I have read where folks have been including cover crop seed when they're applying their manure slurry, and from what I've seen, it's been successful most of the time. They haven't had any real big failures with it, so I think it would be a very viable approach to get that done all in one shot.
Okay. Now in terms of species diversity, there can be some wide variation among cultivars of certain species. Could we count different cultivars as different species, or would we not lump those, not be able to split those out, and really need to have distinct, scientific species in that mix?
I tend to look at things as diversity as separate species, but if you did have different cultivars within a species, I don't see any problem with that as long as we had enough overall diversity in the mix. You might want different cultivars of millet for their different grazability or their different carbon-nitrogen ratios. But I tend to look at species as species and not necessarily cultivars for the purposes of diversity.
Okay, now on the topic of grazing, is grazing a cover crop compatible with a 340 cover crop standard?
That I would have to check, but as long as we're leaving enough residue out there to meet the goals of what that cover crop was designed for, I don't see why it would be an issue.
Okay, now quite a few no-tillers notice an increase in slug damage, and there's concern that adding these cover crops with all this residue and organic activity, that it could make the slug problem worse. Do you have thoughts on this?
We don't have so much of an issue here with slugs, but we sometimes have situations where we grow crops that produce a lot of residue, like winter wheat, that's very high carbon, and we want to get that stuff to break down and cycle before we would go to another crop where that excessive amount of residue might be an issue. And so we've planted some cover crop mixes that are very low carbon-nitrogen ratio, that have a lot of legumes, turnips, radishes, things like that, to get that residue to decompose. So while that cover crop is green and growing, it might be attractive to slugs, but after that, it may get some of that residue to decompose where you wouldn't have quite the volume of residue on the surface.
Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of our audience are in dairy producing areas, and a very popular dairy crop is a pure stand of alfalfa. And so we have, during a 4 or 5 year cycle in a rotation, a single species in those fields that's really pretty weak on diversity for long portions of the rotation. Have you seen people trying to address the lack of diversity in some of these rotations, and anything that you might offer as a suggestion for these kind of layers?
Well, if they could, this case study that I have up this slide right now from Montana, this individual had a pasture that was basically dominated by crested wheatgrass, a single species of cool season perennial grass, and it was declining quite a bit. So he decided to plant this multi-species cover crop that included a few additional species of perennial grasses in there to not only produce some short-term forage to save him some money during this drought when he would have had to buy hay, but also to add the diversity to the soil, to stimulate that soil and prime that soil so that the grass species that he had out there would respond. Instead of reseeding the field or applying fertilizer or things like that, he decided to use this biological priming of this cover crop to get this soil to move to a higher level of biological function to increase his grass production. And we've done similar things with pure stands of alfalfa, where we'll drill cover crop mixtures into these declining stands of alfalfa to add this diversity to the soil and get it rejuvenated, so to speak, to increase the subsequent production on the alfalfa.
Mm-hmm. When working with an organic grower that can't rely on herbicides for weed control, would you recommend higher seeding rates to increase maybe the smothering performance of the cover crop?
Certainly, and I mentioned the 20 pounds per acre as a minimum. If you're concerned about weed pressure, to maybe include some species in your cover crop, such as buckwheat, that tend to be very competitive, and up your seeding rates so that your cover crop is what dominates and gets ahead of the weeds. When we look at a cover crop seeding that has at least 20 pounds and 5 different species, when we walk out in those mixes, we see very few weeds. But if we have a lower seeding rate or fewer species, we'll see more weeds out in those plantings.
When we're trying to jumpstart the soil biology with cover crops and we're transitioning into this system, would we opt for lower carbon to nitrogen ratios at below 24:1? Would that help us in the short term to meet our longer term soil health objectives?
As long as you're careful to not have such a low carbon nitrogen ratio that you'll end up with bare soil, would be my caution. So yeah, legumes can be an excellent thing. Growing or including species in your cover crop that are not in your crop rotation is also one that has really made a difference in jump-starting the soil biology.
You showed a producer mixing multiple species in the drill hopper. So when mixing something different seed size, Australian pea, large seed versus with radish, and it's a small seed, is there any trick or is there difficulty in keeping those species mixed up in the grain bins to while it's planting a number of acres that we're trying to cover with a full hopper?
We thought that would be an issue when we did some of these, but we realized that it really isn't. Those seeds don't sort themselves out as much as you would think they would. If you were planting a mixture that had very small seeded things like alfalfa or some of the clovers, along with some very large seeded things, and not a lot of other species in the mix, there it might be advantageous to put those small seeded in a separate legume box, in a separate box metered separately, so that you get a better distribution of your seed. But with these diverse mixes, we have such a range of seed sizes that they really don't sort out as much as you might think they would.
In seed size, you talk about a general recommendation of 20 pounds per acre, with the different sizes of seeds. How many seeds are we really looking to drop on a square foot, or how do we put that in context of density and numbers of plants just being seeded?
I guess I don't usually look at it as plants per square foot. We calibrate the drill for that many pounds per acre, and go from there. I don't usually look at it as seeds per square foot, but a guy could sure figure that out.
And I suppose with with that diversity of functional groups, we're going to have some large and some small, and well graded as far as seed size.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one viewer mentions the Midwest Cover Crop Council website that serves, 6 or 7 states in the Midwest. Is a great resource for looking at current research being done in cover cropping, including the slurry seeding method.
Yes, yes, that's an excellent resource.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to you now, John, to go on with your next portion of your presentation.
Okay. So I guess I already told the story on this this little cover crop that was used in Montana on some perennial grass pasture and hayland to rejuvenate the stand. So that's something that we've done in a situation other than just normal cropland. In New Mexico, just a quick example, how they would manage pecan orchards. Now they're still using drip irrigation, but they're putting some perennial cover crops in between these rows of pecans and feeding the soil and actually keeping that soil a little bit cooler and a little bit more biologically active, and it's reducing particularly their pest pressure because there's a lot of parasite or parasitizing insects that live in these cover crops that will help control the insects up in the trees. So instead of having a biological desert out there, they have some diversity and some life that actually helps them in their integrated pest management. Just some examples, a few examples from Idaho, whether they're using it to provide some cover after potato harvest, or to provide something for grazing, or just to add some diversity to some of these crop rotations. And some of these are dryland, some of them are irrigated, but they're doing a lot of interesting things, just getting some cover out there, feeding the soil during an extended period of time when that soil would have otherwise laid fallow. And the last little case study from North Dakota here that I wanted to show on Richter Farms, where they had the goals of having soil cover, diversity, increasing soil organic matter on very sandy soils, increasing water infiltration and nutrient cycling, and integrating livestock into this whole picture. So here's the mix of species and amounts that they had, and you can see they were upwards of 30 pounds per acre with different crop types, different species in their mix. And here's what it looked like back in August of 2007. And when we have, when the Burleigh County Soil Conservation District has tours out there, they usually get hundreds of producers, and we've joked about if we ever wanted to terminate a cover crop by rolling it, instead we could just have a tour out there, and if we have hundreds of producers, we could walk them across the field, and they could roll that cover crop for us at the same time. Okay, so they're weighing these calves that they're going to graze this cover crop with cow-calf pairs. So they're weighing the calves, and they turn these cow-calf pairs out there for a period of 10 days in this cover crop, and they work their way through eating what they liked first, obviously, or what they were familiar with, and then working through the other species that were out there. But we were feeding the cows and we were feeding the underground herd. So then we weighed the calves at the end and found that they gained about 3 pounds a day, which is a pretty respectable gain. Doing the numbers on that, numbers of calves and what they gained, we grossed over $100 an acre by grazing this cover crop. And then we look at the cost of the seed, the seeding, and the herbicide that was used ahead of seeding at $45. And we do the rest of the math. They found that they made $66 an acre from grazing those cover crops. Now, the advantages that they had on giving more recovery time on native rangeland is not factored into this, how much it improved soil health, and how much it improved the body condition of the cows. This is just looking at the weight of the calves. So there were a lot of other benefits, but they found that they came out about $66 an acre ahead by growing this cover crop and grazing it. In another situation,
John, this is Mark. I do want to point out that we're at 3:06 Eastern, so we're well into finishing the first hour, and so we want to maybe moderate the final portion of the presentation with that in mind. Thanks.
Okay. So we took water samples, and this just speaks to the difference of where we had a cover crop or no cover crop and how much water was left in the soil. And we found the difference was very negligible. So to have a cover crop or to not, the water is still going to either evaporate or grow a cover crop, so why not grow a cover crop? This is what it looked like. Make sure we covered the soil, and then that should wrap that up. And then I wanted to show
give them an orientation to the site here, and so everybody can find their way back there.
Yeah, I just wanted to give them a quick look at this cover crop calculator. You can put in choose your species, and then it shows you your carbon nitrogen ratio depending on the maturity stage, how suitable it would be for grazing, etc. Gives you an idea of pounds per acre, cost per acre, that sort of thing. So it's a really handy tool to use when you're looking at developing a mix.
Very nice. greencoverseed.com. Now, one more question came in, and I don't think we can really do it justice, but for the 300-plus people who have tuned into this, I think it's a very interesting situation that we're all dealing with. While we can clearly see the advantage of cover crops and soil health and many other goals and purposes that the cover crops are serving, we know that it's still a very small percentage of farmers using cover crops. So what can we do? What kind of effective strategies can we develop to demonstrate, to show farmers, to help them begin adoption in a big way so that we can really get through the majority of farmers in short order? This is something that we're all facing in various parts of the country. And
I think the key to that is to start small. We work with our producers and we come up with some of these ideas for purposes for cover crops or mixes, and we have them start small in however many acres they feel comfortable with taking the risk of spending the money and the time to plant these mixtures, and then see how they work. And things that don't work, we learn from just as much as the things that do work. But we tell them, don't do this on your whole farm. Pick a field, see how it works, get things figured out before you would move on to do it more extensively. So for farmers to experiment and then have tours or demonstrations where that information can be shared has been very effective, and eventually producers will do it on more and more acres.
Okay, very good. We appreciate this presentation this afternoon very much. Thank you very much, John, and thank you all for tuning in today.